Book 4. The Continuation of the Truths of Scripture. Objections against the System of Moses. Chapter 1. Chronology. Some learned men, having inferred from the history of man, or that of the earth, that the world is of higher antiquity than that ascribed to it in the Mosaic account, we have frequent quotations from Sanchoniotho, Porphyry, the Sanskrit books, and other sources in support of this opinion. But have they, who lay so much stress on these authorities, always consulted them in their originals? In the first place, it is rather presumptuous to intimate that Origen, Eusebius, Bossuet, Pascal, Fenelon, Bacon, Newton, Leibniz, Hewitt, and many others were either ignorant or weak men, or wrote in opposition to their real sentiments. They believed in the truth of the Mosaic history, and it cannot be denied that these men possessed learning in comparison with which our imperfect erudition makes a very insignificant figure. But to begin with chronology, our modern scholars have made a mere sport of removing the insurmountable difficulties which confounded a Scaliger, a Petau, an Usher, a Grotius. They would laugh at our ignorance, were we to inquire when the Olympiads commenced. How they agree with the modes of computation by archons, by euphori, by Italis, by consuls, by reigns, by Pythian, Nemean, and secular games. How all the calendars of nations harmonize together. In what manner we must proceed to make the ancient year of Romulus, consisting of 10 months, or 354 days, accord with Numa's year of 355, or the Julian year of 365. By what means we shall avoid errors in referring these same years to the common Attic year of 354 days, and to the embolismic year of 384. These, however, are not only perplexities in respect to years. The ancient Jewish year had but 354 days. Sometimes 12 days were added to the end of the year, and sometimes a month of 30 days was introduced after the month Adar to form a solar year. The modern Jewish year counts 12 months and takes 7 years of 13 months in the space of 19 years. The Syriac year also varies and consists of 365 days. The Turkish or Arabic year has 354 days and admits 11 intercalary months and 29 years. The Egyptian year is divided into 12 months of 30 days, 5 days being added to the last. The Persian year, called Yezdegerdek, has a similar computation. Besides these various methods of counting time, all these years have neither the same beginning, nor the same hours, nor the same days, nor the same divisions. The civil year of the Jews, like all those of the Orientals, commences with the new moon of September, and their ecclesiastical year with the new moon of March. The Greeks reckon the first month of their year from the new moon following the summer solstice. The first month of the Persian year corresponds with our June, and the Chinese and Indians begin theirs from the first moon in March. We find, moreover, astronomical and civil months, which are subdivided into lunar and solar, into synodical and periodical. We have months distributed into kalends, ides, decades, weeks. We find days of two kinds, artificial and natural, and commencing the latter at sunrise, as among the ancient Babylonians, Syrians, and Persians, the former at sunset, as in China, in modern Italy, and of old among the Athenians, the Jews, and the barbarians of the north. The Arabs begin their days at noon. The French, the English, the Germans, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese at midnight. Lastly, the very hours are not without their perplexities in chronology, being divided into Babylonian, Italian, and astronomical. And were we to be still more particular, we should no longer reckon 60 minutes in a European hour, but 1,080 scruples in that of a Chaldea and Arabia. Chronology has been termed the torch of history. Would to God we had no other to throw a light upon the crimes of men, but what would be our embarrassment if in pursuing this subject we entered upon the different periods, eras, or epochs? The Victorian period, which embraces 532 years, is formed by the multiplication of the solar and lunar cycles. The same cycles, multiplied by that of the indiction, produce the 7,980 years of the Julian period. The period of Constantinople comprehends an equal number of years with the Julian period, but does not begin at the same epoch. As to eras, they reckon in some places by the year of the creation, and others by Olympiads, by the foundation of Rome, by the birth of Christ, by the epoch of Eusebius, by that of the Seleucidae or Nabonassar, or of the martyrs. The Turks have their Hegira, the Persians their Yezdegerdik. The Julian, Gregorian, Iberian, and Actian eras are also employed in computation. We shall say nothing concerning the Arundelian marbles, the medals, and monuments of all sorts, which create additional confusion in chronology. Is there any candid person who will deny after glancing at these pages that so many arbitrary modes of calculating time are sufficient to make of history a frightful chaos? The annals of the Jews, by whose confessions of scientific men themselves, are the only ones of whose chronology is simple, regular, and luminous. Why, then, impelled by an ardent zeal for impiety, should we puzzle ourselves with the questions of computation, as dry as they are inexplicable, when we possess the surest clue to guide us in history? This is a new evidence in favor of the Holy Scriptures. Chapter 2. Logography and Historical Facts. After the chronological objections against the Bible come those which some writers have pretended to deduce from historical facts themselves. They inform us of a tradition among the priests of Thebes, which supposed the kingdom of Egypt to have existed 18,000 years, and they cite the list of its dynasties, which is still extant. Plutarch, who cannot be suspected of Christianity, will furnish us with part of the reply to this objection. Though their year, he says, as speaking of the Egyptians, comprehended 4 months, according to some authors, yet at first it consisted of only one, and contained no more than the course of a single moon. In this way, making a year of a single month, the period which has elapsed from their origin appears extremely long, and they are reputed to have the most ancient people, though they settled in their contrary at a later period. We learn, moreover, from Herodotus, Diodorus, Siculus, Justin, Strabo, and Jablonski, that the Egyptians find a pretended glory in referring their origin to the remotest antiquity, and as it were concealing their birth in the obscurity of ages. The number of their reigns can scarcely be a source of difficulty. It is well known that the Egyptian dynasties are composed of contemporary sovereigns. Besides, the same word in the Oriental languages may be read in 5 or 6 different ways, and our ignorance has often made 5 or 6 persons out of one individual. The same thing has happened in regard to the translation of a single name. The Athoth of the Egyptians is translated as Eratosthenes, which signifies in Greek the learned, as Athoth expresses the same thing in Coptic. But historians have not failed to make 2 kings of Athoth and Hermes, or Hermogenes. But the Athoth of Menetho is again multiplied. In Plato he is transformed into Thoth. And the text of Sanchoniotho proves, in fact, that this is the primitive name, the letter, a being one of those which are retrenched or added at pleasure in the Oriental languages. Thus the name of the man whom Africanus calls Pachnas is rendered by Josephus as Apachnas. Here then we have Thoth, Athoth, Hermes or Hermogenes, or Mercury, 5 celebrated men who occupied together nearly 2 centuries. Yet these 5 kings were but one single Egyptian, who perhaps did not live 60 years. What necessity is there, after all, to lay so much stress on logographica disputes, when we need but open the volumes of history to convince ourselves of the modern origin of men? In vain shall we combine with imaginary ages or conjure up fictitious shades of death. All this will not prevent mankind from being but a creature of yesterday. The names of those who invented the arts are as familiar to us as those of a brother or a grandfather. It was Hypsiranius who built huts of reeds, the habitations of primeval innocence. Euseus first clothed himself with the skins of beasts, and braved the billows on the trunk of a tree. Tubal-Cain taught men the uses of iron. Noah or Bacchus planted the vine. Cain or Triptolemus fashioned the plow. Agrates or Cyrus reaped the first harvest. History, medicine, geometry, the fine arts, and laws are not of higher antiquity, and we are indebted for them to Herodotus, Hippocrates, Thales, Homer, Daedalus, and Minos. As to the origin of kings and cities, their history has been transmitted to us by Moses, Plato, Justin, and some others, and we know when and why the various forms of government were established among different nations. If we are astonished to find such grandeur and magnificence in the early cities of Asia, this difficulty is easily removed by an observation founded on the genius of the Eastern nations. In all ages it has been the custom of these nations to build immense cities, which however afford no evidence respecting their civilization and consequently their antiquity. The Arabs, who travel over burning sands where they are quite satisfied to enjoy a little shade under a tent of sheepskins, have erected almost under our eyes gigantic cities, which the citizens of the desert seem to have designed as the enclosures of solitude. The Chinese also, who have made so little progress in the arts, have the most extensive cities on the face of the globe, with walls, gardens, palaces, lakes, and artificial canals like those of ancient Babylon. Finally, are we not ourselves a striking instance of the rapidity with which nations become civilized? Scarcely 12 centuries ago, our ancestors were as barbarous as the Hottentots, and now we surpass Greece in all the refinements of taste, luxury, and the arts. The general logic of languages cannot furnish any valid argument in favor of the antiquity of mankind. The idioms of the primitive East, far from indicating a very ancient state of society, exhibit on the contrary a close proximity to that of nature. Their mechanism is simple in the highest degree. Hyperbole, metaphor, and all the poetic figures incessantly recur. But you will find in them scarcely any words for the expression of metaphysical ideas. It would be impossible to convey with a perspicuity in the Hebrew language the theology of the Christian doctrine. Among the Greeks and the modern Arabs alone, we meet with compound terms capable of expressing the abstractions of thought. Everybody knows that Aristotle was the first philosopher who invented categories, in which ideas are placed together by a forced arrangement, of whatever class or nature they might be. Lastly, it is asserted that before the Egyptians had erected those temples of which such beautiful ruins yet remain, the people already tended their flocks amid ruins left by some unknown nation, a circumstance which would presuppose a very high antiquity. To decide this question, it is necessary to ascertain precisely who were the pastoral tribes and whence they came. Bruce, the British traveler who finds everything in Ethiopia, derives their origin from that country. The Ethiopians, however, so far from being able to send colonies abroad, were themselves at that period a recently established people. The Ethiopians, says Eusebius, rising from the banks of the river Indus, settled near Egypt. Manetho, in his 6th dynasty, calls the shepherds Phoenician strangers. Eusebius places their arrival in Egypt during the reign of Amenophis, whence we must draw these two inferences. 1. That Egypt was not then barbarous, since Inachus, the Egyptian, about this period, introduced the sciences into Greece. 2. That Egypt was not covered with ruins, since Thebes was then built, and since Amenophis was the father of Sesostris, who raised the glory of the Egyptians to its highest pitch. According to Josephus the historian, it was Thutmosis who compelled the shepherds to abandon altogether the banks of the Nile. But what new arguments would have been urged against the Scripture had its adversaries been acquainted with another historical prodigy, which also belongs to the class of ruins, alas, like everything connected with the history of mankind? Within these few years, extraordinary monuments have been discovered in North America, on the banks of the Muskingum, the Miami, the Wabash, the Ohio, and particularly in Scioto, where they occupy a space upward of 20 leagues in length. They consist of ramparts of earth, with ditches, slopes, moons, half-moons, and prodigious cones, which serve for sepulchres. It has been asked what people could have left these remains, but so far the question has not been answered. Man is suspended in the present between the past and the future, as on a rock between two gulfs. Behind, before, all around is darkness, and scarcely does he see the few phantoms which, rising up from the bottom of either abyss, float for a moment upon the surface and then disappear. Whatever conjectures may be formed respecting these American ruins, though they were accompanied with the visions of a primitive world or the chimeras of an Atlantis, the civilized nation, whose plow perhaps turned up the plains where the Iroquois now pursues the bear, required no longer time for the consummation of its destiny than that which swallowed up the empire of a Cyrus, an Alexander, and a Caesar. Fortunate, at least, is that nation which has not left behind a name in history, and whose possessions have fallen to no other heirs than the deer of the forest and the birds of the air. No one will come into these savage wilds to deny the Creator, and with scales in his hand to weigh the dust of departed humanity with a view to prove the eternal duration of mankind. For my part, a solitary lover of nature and a simple confessor of the deity, I once sat on those very ruins. A traveler without renown, I held converse with those relics, like myself, unknown. The confused recollections of society and the vague reveries of the desert were blended in the recesses of my soul. Night had reached the middle of her course. All was solemn and still. The moon, the woods, and the sepulchres, save that at long intervals was heard the fall of some tree, which the axe of time laid low in the depths of the forest. Thus everything falls, everything goes to ruin. We do not conceive ourselves obliged to speak seriously of the 4 Jogas, or Indian ages, the first of which lasted 3,200,000 years, the second 1,000,000, the third 1,600,000, while the fourth, which is the present age, will comprehend 400,000 years. If to all these difficulties of chronology, logography, and facts we add the errors arising from the passions of the historian, or of men who are the partisans of his theories, if, moreover, we take into account the errors of copyists and 1,000 accidents of time and place, we shall be compelled to acknowledge that all the reasons drawn from history in favor of the antiquity of the globe are as unsatisfactory in themselves as their research is useless. Most assuredly, too, it is a poor way of establishing the duration of the world, to make human life the basis of the calculation. Will you pretend to demonstrate the permanence and the reality of things by the rapid succession of momentary shadows? Will you exhibit a heap of rubbish as the evidence of a society without beginning and without end? Does it require many days to produce a pile of ruins? The world would be old indeed were we to number its years by the wrecks which it presents to our view. Chapter 3. Astronomy. In the history of the firmament are sought the second proofs of the antiquity of the world and the errors of Scripture. Thus the heavens, which declare the glory of God unto all men, and whose language is heard by all nations, proclaim nothing to the infidel. Happily, it is not that the celestial orbs are mute, that the atheist is deaf. Astronomy owes its origin to shepherds. In the wilds of the primitive creation, the first generations of men beheld their infant families and their numerous flocks sporting around them, and, happy to the very inmost of their souls, no useless foresight disturbed their repose. In the departure of the birds of autumn, they remarked not the flight of years, neither did the fall of the leaves apprise them of anything more than the return of winter. When the neighboring hill was stripped of all its herbage by their flocks, mounting their wagons, covered with skins, with their children and their wives, they traversed the forest in quest of some distant river, where the coolness of the shade and the beauty of the wilderness invited them to fix their new habitation. But they wanted a compass to direct them through those trackless forests and along those rivers which had never been explored, and they naturally trusted to the guidance of the stars, by whose appearances they steered their course. At once legislators and guides, they regulated the shearing of the sheep and the most distant migrations. Each family followed the course of a constellation. Each star shone as the leader of a flock. In proportion as these pastoral people applied to this study they discovered new laws. In those days, God was pleased to unfold the course of the sun to the tenants of the lowly cabin, and fable recorded that Apollo had descended among the shepherds. Small columns of brick were raised to perpetuate the remembrance of observations. Never had the mightiest empire a more simple history. With the same tool with which he pierced his pipe, by the same altar on which he had sacrificed his firstling kid, the herdsman engraved upon a rock his immortal discoveries. In other places he left similar witnesses of this pastoral astronomy. He exchanged annals with the firmament, and with the same manner as he had inscribed the records of the stars among his flocks, he wrote the records of his flocks among the constellations of the zodiac. The sun retired to rest only in the sheepfolds. The bull announced by his bellowing the passage of the god of day, and the ram awaited his appearance to salute him in the name of his master. In the skies were discovered ears of corn, implements of agriculture, virgins, lambs, nay, even the shepherd's dog. The whole sphere was transformed, as it were, into a spacious rural mansion, inhabited by the shepherd of men. These happy days passed away, but mankind retained a confused tradition of them in those accounts of the Golden Age in which the reign of the stars was invariably blended with that of the pastoral life. India has still an astronomical and pastoral character like Egypt of old. With corruption, however, arose property, with property mensuration, the second age of astronomy. But, by a destiny not a little remarkable, the simplest nations were still best acquainted with the system of the heavens. The herdsmen of the Ganges fell into errors less gross than the philosopher of Athens, as if the muse of astronomy had retained a secret partiality for the shepherds, the objects of her first attachment. During those protracted calamities which accompanied and succeeded the fall of the Roman Empire, the sciences had no other asylum than the sanctuary of that church which they now so ungratefully profane. Cherished in the silence of the convents, they owed their preservation to those same recluses, whom in our days they affect to despise. A Friar Bacon, a Bishop Albert, a Cardinal Cusa resuscitated in their laborious vigils the genius of an Eudoxus, a Timarchus, an Hipparchus, and a Ptolemy. Patronized by the popes who set an example to kings, the sciences at length spread abroad from those sacred retreats which religion had gathered them under her protecting wings. Astronomy revived in every quarter. Gregory XIII corrected the calendar. Copernicus reformed the system of the world. Tycho Brahe, from the top of his tower, renewed the memory of the ancient Babylonian observers. Kepler determined the figure of the planetary orbits. But God humbled again the pride of man by granting to the sports of innocence what he had refused to the investigations of philosophy. The telescope was discovered by children. Galileo improved the new instrument, when, behold, the paths of immensity were at once shortened. The genius of man brought down the heavens from their elevation, and the stars came to be measured by his hands. These numerous discoveries were but the forerunners of others still more important, for man had approached too near the sanctuary of nature not to be soon admitted within its precincts. Nothing was now wanted but the proper methods of relieving his mind from the vast calculations which overwhelmed it. Descartes soon ventured to refer to the great Creator, the physical laws of our globe, and by one of those strokes of genius, of which only 4 or 5 instances are recorded in history, he effected a union between algebra and geometry in the same manner as speech is combined with thought. Newton had only to apply the materials with which so many hands had prepared for him, but he did it like a perfect artist. And from the various plans upon which he might have reared the edifice of the spheres, he selected the noblest, the most sublime design, perhaps that of deity himself. The understanding at length ascertained the order which the eye admired. The golden balance which Homer and the Scriptures give to the supreme arbiter was again put into his hand. The comet submitted, planet attracted, planted across the regions of immensity. Ocean felt the pressure of 2 vast bodies floating millions of leagues from its surface. From the sun to the minutest atom, all things continued in their places by an admirable equilibrium, and nothing in nature now wanted a counterpoise but the heart of man. Who could have thought it? At the very time when so many new proofs of the greatness and wisdom of Providence were discovered, there were men who shut their eyes more closely than ever against the light. Not that those immortal geniuses, Copernicus, Tycho, Brahe, Kepler, Leibniz, and Newton, were atheists, but their successors, by an unaccountable fatality, imagined that they held the deity within their crucibles and telescopes, because they had perceived in them some of the elements with which the universal mind had founded the system of worlds. When we recall the terrors of the French Revolution, when we consider to the vanity of science we owe almost all our calamities, is it not enough to make us think that man was on point of perishing once more for having a second time raised his hand to the fruit of the tree of knowledge? Let this afford us matter for reflection on the original crime. The ages of science have always bordered on the ages of destruction. Truly unfortunate, in our opinion, is the astronomer who can pass his nights in contemplating the stars without beholding inscribed upon them the name of God. What? Can he not see in such a variety of figures and characters the letters which compose that divine name? Is not the problem of a deity solved by the mysterious calculations of so many suns? Does not the brilliant algebra of the heavens suffice to bring to light the great unknown? The first astronomical objection alleged against the system of Moses is founded on the celestial sphere. "How can the world be so modern?" exclaims the philosopher. "The very composition of the sphere implies millions of years." It must also be admitted that astronomy was one of the first sciences cultivated by men. Bailey proves that the patriarchs before the time of Noah were acquainted with the periods of 600 years, the year of 365 days, 5 hours, 51 minutes, 36 seconds, and likewise that they named the 6 days of the creation after the planetary order. If the primitive generations were already so conversant with the history of the heavens, is it not highly probable that the ages which have elapsed since the deluge have been more than sufficiently to bring the sciences of astronomy to the state in which we find it at the present day? It is impossible to pronounce with certainty respecting the time necessary for the development of a science. From Copernicus to Newton, astronomy made greater progress in 1 century than it had previously done in the course of 3,000 years. The sciences may be compared to regions diversified with plains and mountains. We proceed with rapid pace over the plain, but when we reach the foot of the mountain, a considerable time is lost in exploring its paths and in climbing the summit from which we descend into another plane. It must not be then concluded that astronomy was myriad of centuries in its infancy, because its middle age was protracted during 4,000 years. Such an idea would contradict all that we know of history and of the progress of the human mind. The second objection is deduced from the historical epochs, combined with the astronomical observations of nations, and in particular those of the Chaldeans and Indians. In regard to the former, it is well known that the 720,000 years of which they boasted are reducible to 1903. As to the observation of the Indians, those which are founded on incontestable facts date no farther back than the year 3102, before the Christian era. This we admit to be a very high degree of antiquity, but it comes at least within known limits. At this epoch, the fourth Jog, or Indian Age, commences. Bailey, combining the first 3 ages and adding them to the fourth, shows that the whole chronology of the Brahmins is comprised in the space of about 70 centuries, which exactly corresponds with the chronology of the Septuagint. He proves to the demonstration that the chronicles of the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Chinese, the Persians, and the Indians coincide in a remarkable degree with the epochs of Scripture. We quote Bailey the more willingly, as that philosopher fell a victim to the principles which we have undertaken to refute. When this unfortunate man, in speaking of Hypatia, a young female astronomer murdered by the inhabitants of Alexandria, observed that the moderns at least spare life, though they show no mercy to reputation, Little did he suspect that he would himself afford a lamentable proof of the fallacy of his assertion, and that in his own person the tragic story of Hypatia would be repeated. In short, all these endless series of generations and centuries, which are to be met with among different nations, spring from a weakness natural to the human heart. Man feels within himself a principle of immortality, and shrinks, as it were, with shame from the contemplations of his brief existence. He imagines that by piling tombs upon tombs, he will hide from view this capital defect of his nature, and by adding nothing to nothing, he will at length produce eternity. But he only betrays himself and reveals what he is so anxious to conceal. For the higher the funeral pyramid is reared, the more diminutive seems the living statue that surmounts it, and life appears the more insignificant when the monstrous phantom of death lifts it up in its arms. Chapter 4. Natural History. The Deluge. Astronomy having been found insufficient to destroy the chronology of Scripture, natural history was summoned to its aid. Some writers speak of certain epochs in which the whole universe grew young again. Others deny the great catastrophes of the globe, such as the universal deluge. Rain, they say, is nothing but the vapor of the ocean. Now all these seas of the globe would not be sufficient to cover the earth at the height of mentioned in Scripture. We might reply that this mode of reasoning is at variance with that very knowledge of which men boast so much nowadays, as modern chemistry teaches us that air may be converted into water. Were this the case, what a frightful deluge would be witnessed! That passing over, as we willingly do, those scientific arguments which explain everything to the understanding without satisfying the heart, we shall confine ourselves to the remark that to submerge the terrestrial portions of the globe, it is sufficient for ocean to overlap his bounds, carrying with him the waters of the fathomless gulf. Besides, ye presumptuous mortals, have ye penetrated into the treasures of the hail? Are ye acquainted with all the reservoirs of that abyss which the Lord will call forth death on the dreadful day of his vengeance? Whether God, raising the bed of the sea, poured its turbulent waters over the land, or, changing the course of the sun, caused it to rise at the pole, portentous of evil, the fact is certain that a destructive deluge has laid waste the earth. On this occasion the human race was nearly annihilated. All national quarrels were at an end. All revolutions ceased. Kings, people, hostile armies suspended their sanguinary quarrels, and seized with mortal fear embraced one another. The temples were crowded with suppliants, who had all their lives, perhaps, denied the deity. But the deity denied them in his turn, and it was soon announced that all ocean was rushing in at the gates. In vain mothers fled with their infants to the summits of the mountains. In vain the lover expected to find a refuge for his mistress in the same grot which had witnessed his vows. In vain friends disputed with affrighted beasts the topmost branches of the oak. The bird himself, driven from bough to bough by the rising flood, tired his wings to no purpose over the shoreless plains of waters. The sun, which those somber clouds shed a lurid light on naught but scenes of death, appeared dull and empurpled. The volcanoes, disgorging vast masses of smoke, were extinguished, and one of the four elements, fire, perished together with light. The world was now covered with horrible shades, which sent forth the most terrific cries. Amid the humid darkness, the remnant of living creatures, the tiger and the lamb, the eagle and the dove, the reptile and the insect, man and woman hastened together to the most elevated rock on the surface of the globe. But ocean still pursued them, and raising round them his stupendous and menacing waters, buried the last point of land beneath his stormy wastes. God, having accomplished his vengeance, commanded the seas to retire within the abyss. But he determined to impress on the globe everlasting traces of his wrath. The relics of the elephant of India were piled upon the regions of Siberia. The shellfish of the Magellanic shores was fixed in the quarries of France. Whole beds of marine substances settled upon the summits of the Alps, of Taurus and of the Cordilleras, and of those mountains themselves were the monuments which God left in their three worlds to commemorate his triumph over the wicked as a monarch erects a trophy on the field where he has defeated his enemies. He was not satisfied, however, with these general attestations of his past indignation. Knowing how soon the remembrance of calamity is effaced from the mind of man, he spread memorials of it everywhere around him. The sun had now no other throne in the morning, no other couch at night than the watery element in which it seemed to be daily extinguished, as at the time of the deluge. Often the clouds of heaven resembled waves heaped upon one another, sandy shores or whitened cliffs. On land, the rocks discharged torrents of water. The light of the moon and the white vapors of evening at times gave to the valleys the appearance of being covered with a sheet of water. The most arid situations grew trees, whose bending branches hung heavily toward the earth, as if they had just risen from the bosom of the waves. Twice a day the sea was commanded to rise again in its bed, and to invade its deep resounding shores. The caverns of the mountains retained a hollow and mournful sound. The summits of the solitary woods presented an image of the rolling billows, and the ocean seemed to have left the roar of its waters in the recesses of the forest. Chapter 5. Youth and Old Age of the Earth. We now come to the third objection relative to the modern origin of the globe. The earth, it is said, is an aged nurse who betrays her antiquity in everything. Examine her fossils, her marbles, her granites, her lavas, and you will discover in them a series of innumerable years, marked by circles, strata, or branches, as the age of a serpent is determined by his rattles, that of a horse by his teeth, or that of a stag by his antlers. This difficulty has been solved 100 times by the following answer. God might have created, and doubtless did create, the world with all the marks of antiquity and completeness which it now exhibits. What, in the fact, can be more probable than that the author of nature originally produced both venerable forests and young plantations, and that the animals were created, some full of days, others adorned with the graces of infancy? The oaks, on springing from the fruitful soil, doubtless bore at once the aged crows, and the new progeny of doves. Worm, chrysalis, and butterfly, the insect crawled upon the grass, suspended its golden egg in the forest, or fluttered aloft in the air. The bee, though she had lived but a morning, already gathered her ambrosia from generations of flowers. We may imagine that the ewe was not without her lamb, nor the linnet without her young, and that the flowering shrubs concealed among their buds nightingales, astonished at the warbling notes in which they expressed the tenderness of their first enjoyments. If the world had not been at the same time young and old, the grand, the serious, the moral would have been banished from the face of nature, for these are ideas essentially inherent in antique objects. Every scene would have lost its wonders. The rock and ruins would no longer have overhung the abyss with its pendant herbage. The forest, stripped of their accidents, would no longer have exhibited the pleasing irregularity of trees curved in every direction, and of trunks bending over the currents of rivers. The inspired thoughts, the venerable sounds, the magic voices, the sacred awe of the forests would have been wanting, together with the darksome bowers which serve for their retreats, and the solitudes of earth and heaven would have remained bare and unattractive without those columns of oaks which joined them together. We may well suppose that the very day the ocean poured its first waves upon the shores, they dashed against rocks already worn over strands covered with fragments of shellfish, and around barren capes which protected the sinking coasts against the ravages of the waters. Without this original antiquity, there would have been neither beauty nor magnificence in the work of the Almighty. And what could not possibly be the case, nature in a state of innocence would have been less charming than she is in her present degenerate condition. A general infancy of plants, of animals, of elements would have spread an air of dullness and languor throughout the world, and stripped it of all poetical inspiration. But God was not so unskilful a designer of the groves of Eden as infidels pretend. Man, the Lord of the earth, was ushered into life with the maturity of 30 years, that the majesty of his being might accord with the antique grandeur of his new empire, and in like manner his partner doubtless shone in all the blooming graces of female beauty when she was formed from Adam, that she might be in unison with the flowers and the birds, with innocence and love, and with all the youthful part of the universe. This is the end of Book 4 from Part 1 of The Genius of Christianity by Chateaubriand. Thank you for listening.